After we have shown in our last presentation of the series, Part 8, how mass can be created by additional, potentially compactified dimensions, we will here apply this concept to try to understand the psychological process of mass formation psychosis from a completely mathematical point of view. For this, we are going to apply what we think is a so-called theory of everything approach. With respect to the process of mass formation and mass formation psychosis, we refer to the book of Professor Matthias Desmet about the psychology of totalitarianism. In here, where we want to concentrate on the math to potentially and effectively describe this psychological process of the masses, we are only going to give a very brief overview. In difference to dictatorships, where obedience is being created from a basic fear of the dictator, totalitarianism produces obedience via mass hypnosis. In psychology, this mass hypnosis is called mass formation. Such a process requires 4 conditions. First of all, the masses must feel alone and isolated. Second, their lives must feel pointless and meaningless. These conditions have been growing for years with social media, for example, narcissism, sociopathy, addiction, and mental illness, and an education system which generally suppresses holistic analysis and broader, if not to say, lateral thinking. In other and very simple words, the people are mentally squeezed into boxes, and these boxes are not just becoming smaller and smaller, they are also having lesser and lesser dimensions or attributes. Third, the masses then must experience constant free-floating anxiety, and fourth, they must experience free-floating frustration and aggression. Free-floating means here that there is no discernible source for the anxiety or aggression. And so the person begins to irrationally crave a remedy, no matter how absurd or destructive it may be. The moment these conditions are met, people are ripe for hypnosis. No matter how stupid, senseless, or even harmful this solution is, people are made to feel solidarity, to contribute in some free-floating, undiscernible way when following the proposed solution. This validates the whole thing for them, and they are becoming blind towards the damage the remedy might cause to them, to the society, and yes, even their own children. They are lesser than Pavlov's famous dogs, but even degenerated ones. They are now changed, no longer rational. People become intolerant and cruel. By the way, when trying to understand this process, some experts try to apply game theory. However, this creation of irrationality automatically excludes mathematical approaches like Nash's game theory, where all agents are assumed to act completely rationally. In this presentation, we will now aim for an effective mathematical quantum gravity description of the process of mass formation psychosis. It is widely assumed that Einstein's general theory of relativity cannot be combined with quantum theory. At least, so far, nobody has found a truly conclusive way. That being said, we have shown in our previous presentations that A. The job was in principle already done by no other than the German mathematician David Hilbert. B. There is no need to combine quantum theory and general theory of relativity because the latter already contains the first. And C. Mass creation is possible via the entanglement with additional dimensions. For this we refer to Part 8 of our little series. A theory of everything, for which we are aiming here, should not only contain Einstein's general theory of relativity, but also all major quantum equations, and it should also explain the appearance of what we describe as matter. Only as an example, we here show the metric result of the Klein-Gordon equation, which we obtained by applying the Hilbert formalism from a scaled metric tensor. See part 2 and 8 of our series, and its comparison with the classical equivalent. Thus we think we have found, or rather Hilbert has found, a way to derive a theory of everything. The important aspect for our goal of a mathematical description of the process of mass formation requires the understanding and falsifiable presentation of dimensional mass creation and its entanglement with the individual fields of all agents or players in a given socio-economic spacetime. In our last presentation of this series, Part 8, we concentrated on the metric derivation of the Klein-Gordon equation and mass as one of the essential parameters in this very equation. From there, it is simple to also extract the metric appearance of mass for Dirac, Part 3 of this series, Schrödinger, Part 4, and any other quantum equations also for arbitrarily big systems. We could have a simple model which does not aim for a perfect mirroring of a society of individuals, because this would not be possible even with the best supercomputers, but only for the illustration of the method on a small scale. In such an approach, the individuality is being illustrated as wave functions, which actually it is anyway. The more dynamic, healthy and active the individual is, the more complex the multidimensional orbital appearance of the individual spacetime wave density. It is also important to note that the individuality requires the wave function to be fermionic, which means it follows the Pauli exclusion principle and wants to keep its own individuality. There is nothing artificial about this picture, because all our individuality summed up is just a huge set of attributes, partially entangled, and each attribute contributes to the complexity and appearance of the individual's very own halo, psi field, some call it, in the spacetime of society. Of course, we cannot show the full dimensionality of the wave function, because we are unable to visualize more than 3 dimensions. But we can sum up a few dimensions and show the result in the 3 dimensions we can illustrate. This can give us at least a feeling about the appearance of a person's individual field inside a socio-economic spacetime. This is just another word for society, by the way. So, the figures here were actually calculated from individual fields of 10 dimensions, of which only the 3 spatial ones are being shown. Please note that none of the fields has any sharp structures, but always comes as a slightly fuzzy density distribution. This is in perfect congruence with its natural equivalent, namely the field of individuality. This too can never be a sharp object, but always only is a nebular thing. It even needs to be pointed out here that the sharper such an orbital object becomes, the lower its creative content, its innovative potential, its individuality. The sharpest fields, or orbitals, are to be found near the ground states. Thus, when aiming for low individuality in order to herd the masses into a formation psychosis, the goal has to be to load the individual agents within a socio-economic system with so much mass that they are forced into their ground states, where they not only lose their mobility, but also their potential to individually excite anything. In other words, they stop thinking and individually acting. In a mass formation psychosis, these individual fields need to be squashed, distorted, and made less complex, made less fermionic, bosonic then, in order to switch off the Pauli principle and make the individual compliant and ready for compactification. In other words, we need a process of de-individualization. This is being done by external, free-floating fields, and you already see that anxiety is just one such field. In both socioeconomic reality and the model, such a field requires the introduction or activation of an additional degree of freedom, This could be a fear factor against a certain omnipresent entity, like a virus, for example. But this does not suffice, because there can always be threats around and nobody gives a damn about them. There also needs to be a strong entanglement with dimensions defining the individuals. Again, it is the same in reality and the model, which is to say, the model is quite realistic. And here the media, politicians and false experts come in with their fear-mongering. This entanglement then automatically creates what in physics is being called inertia. And as inertia always distorts the space-time they are residing in, we have the desired distortion and squashing of the individual wave fields. And there is another important effect. We know that the increase of inertia due to an additional free-floating field of fear degenerates individuality depending on the strength of entanglement, coupling of the fear field with the individual wave functions or metrics. More inertia, however, leads to a lower probability of excited states like ideas, innovation, evolutionary progressive freedom, readiness to assume a productive risk, seeking new opportunities, and so on, and a higher probability of ground states with mainly bosonic character, compliance. With respect to the current COVID virus crisis, we think that statistical data of vaccine compliance on the one hand and the innovative potential, activity or even job market developments on the other would directly fit into the model of inertia and the multitudes of states of the individual wave fields. Stagnation or even decline here, in reality, would be directly correlated to a lower number of excited states or a shift of their local distribution, more bosonic wave fields, and much more confined orbitals in the model. As we know that this reduction of individuality in the model comes from the inertia produced by the fear field, we can extract some measurable, quantifiable effect from the fear-mongering and fear-entangling taking place in the real world. In other words, we'd have a coupling constant and make your model more robust, mathematically I mean, and thus also falsifiable in a Popper-like sense. All these smaller, distorted and bosonized residuals of those former healthy individuals are then ready for herding into whatever small barn and way of life they, whoever they is, want us in. Not just in the model, but also in reality, the individual with such a degenerated individuality will accept very little for itself, having nothing but being happy all the same, which in fact is rubbish, as it cannot work for true human beings, at least not for elongated time spans. But there are severe problems involved. Problem A with all this? Because the add-on dimensions of fear, after all, it is a free-floating and thus non-graspable anxiety, produces entanglement not only with the target group, but in general. Per definition, it cannot be contained, and thus the whole will also affect the source. It is bound to backfire onto the group who created the fear field, and this makes it very likely that the whole system collapses in the end. See therefore black hole information. Problem B with all this: humans are humans because they have individuality. They are defined by it and they define themselves throughout their individuality. Stripping them of it makes each and every individual degenerated wave function unstable and renders it ready for all sorts of phase transitions. In other words, violence is one of the more likely outcomes. And problem C with all this is annihilations. This will be elaborated in due course, which is to say in one of our next presentations. As we already saw that the process of creation of inertia, mass, is the fundament for both the practical process and the model, we are going to discuss this here in more detail. After all, this aspect is essential for the understanding of the process of de-individualization, and thus perhaps also foreseeing possibilities to hold off this process or even reverse it. The math is not too complicated, and I even think that the fact that we all have this inner picture of ourselves losing individuality and crumbling when being loaded with too much mess, of whatever type it is, helps in understanding why such a Hilbert approach is anything but far off. As this process is somehow the key, we have to endure a bit more math in here. Our starting point is the so-called Einstein-Hilbert action, a variational integral based on a Hamilton extremal principle. Already in 1915, it was the great German mathematician David Hilbert who derived Einstein's field equations from such a fundamental minimum principle. What Hilbert apparently did not see was that his formula in fact contained much more than just the Einstein field equations, but that he had also found the fundament for quantum theory. We will now show that there is much more in Hilbert's formula than probably even Hilbert himself had known. As we have already shown in an earlier presentation, part 1 of our little series, that we do not need the matter term Lm nor a cosmological constant to obtain matter, we set both lambda and Lm equal to 0 and just proceed with the curvature of spacetime, known as the Ricci scalar, as the kernel within our variation. Now, by following Hilbert's classical derivation, we obtain the so-called vacuum Einstein field equations. Things change, however, in a rather interesting manner when introducing a slightly adapted metric tensor with a scaling factor, as shown here. Hilbert's calculus then yields a much more complex kernel. This kernel can dramatically be simplified by demanding the scaling function to fulfill a special condition. Now, we split up the variated contravariant metric tensor into its scaling, and its tensor part is shown here. As a result, we obtain two equations, a scalar and a tensor one. In this presentation, we ignore the tensor equation, for example by assuming that the variation of the metric tensor gives 0, or is so small that we can assume it to vanish against the scalar part. Then we intend to fulfill the scalar, which is to say the first equation, by demanding the kernel of the integral to be equal to 0. This gives us a very simple partial differential equation, and by inserting our setting for the scaling function f, we clearly recognize the similarity to the Klein-Gordon equation. Now we have two options to incorporate mass. In part 2 of this series, we have already shown the possibility of finding this term within the Ricci curvature R. Thereby, we assumed a Minkowski-like spacetime and split up the Laplace operator into its time derivative and its spatial part. Another, and for our purposes here much more important possibility to obtain masses, requires the introduction of higher dimensions. Here is just one example in a spacetime with 6 dimensions. The two additional dimensions shall be u and v, whereby the two are entangled with each other via a coupling function g of v, as shown here. When mirroring our reality, the additional dimensions are describing the free-floating anxiety field, which couples into, or entangles with, the wave functions of the individuals living inside the real socioeconomic spacetime. The coupling is being realized via the general function f. By giving the anxiety or fear function a certain shape and assuming a completely flat spacetime with r equals 0, the Hilbert formalism provides us with a perfect Klein-Gordon quantum equation with mass. Investigation of the function g of v shows us that this function is of bell-like shape and can be arbitrarily compactified. This means that the additional dimensions might not be realized as dimensions, but only occur to us as masses. In other words, the field of fear and anxiety does not even have to become observable or manifest as such in order to a. Still fully affect all aspects of life in reality, and b. still realize the mass creation and subsequent mass formation by the means of the processes described above. Thus, with the theoretical model given here, we already could even make out potentials for a dramatic improvement of the process of mass formation via an optimization of the scalar appearance of the free-floating anxiety field in order to maximally hide it but still maintain its effect. Only for completeness, we also show the resulting Klein-Gordon quantum equation, which, as we have shown above, was completely derived in a metric and thus quantum gravity concept. Thus, we have the possibility to find mass and potential interaction plus other inertia either via additional dimensions or with the Ricci curvature when deriving quantum equations from the Einstein-Hilbert action via the classical Hilbert calculus as shown here. With respect to our application, namely the effective description of the process of mass formation or mass formation psychosis, the approach shown here comes with something else, something many simulators and experts like to ignore, and it has to do with the principal uncertainty of everything, the model, the data we use as input, and the reality, respectively what we realize as reality. By following the rigorous mathematical approach of a quantized metrical description, we always know about the uncertainties in the model, and thus also in the real world, which the model mirrors. Thus, we could avoid this silly discussion about the uncertainty limitations of the calculus by clearly pointing out the total uncertainty budget residing in the model. Always, and in the most holistic manner there can be. In order to obtain good metric equivalence to psychological problems like the mass formation psychosis, we have already developed models with 10 individual attributes, dimensions, and more for each internal agent. The interested reader may find more information in the books shown here or other publications of this author. We explicitly want to point out, however, that we do not consider us the first to have found such connections. In principle, namely, it all was already inside Hilbert's ingenious approach, and he only could not see it because A. At the time he wrote down his equation, the fundamental equations of quantum theory were not yet discovered. B. His main goal was the derivation of the Einstein field equations, and thus, as Einstein had not bothered about also finding quantum equations inside his general theory of relativity, Hilbert, as a mathematician, obviously saw no need to consider the broader spectrum residing in his approach. And finally C. The connection of psychology and quantum theory was not known in 1915. It has been laid out by Young and Pauli many decades after Hilbert's publication. These new insights open up a variety of possibilities for the most astounding developments, be it inexhaustible sources of energy, future weaponry, metric artificial intelligence, quantum gravity computing, or completely new, and what is much more important, truly unbiased and most holistic modeling tools for almost all sorts of problems. And how could such developments be realized? Well, the optimum, of course, is the global approach aiming for the quantum gravity computer and naturalized AI, which is a Manhattan-sized project. How this disrupts everything and makes the owner the global monopoly to just everything can be extracted from the material presented in this talk. A next smaller step is just the naturalized AI, which still is a small Manhattan project. This too already reaches very far and propels the owner into a global monopolistic and long-time leading position, unless somebody achieves a takeover via a working quantum gravity computer tech. And finally, everything else are just service projects.